We begin the current Daf, Mesechת Nazir Daf Mem Gimel. We begin on the bottom of Mem Beis and Mem Beis, 3 lines up at the bottom of the Yomid. We were in the middle of a complex Gemara, even just how to translate the Gemara, but it was talking about regarding the halachas related to the previous Mishnah on Amud Aleph of Tamas Nazir, which the Gemara had, just to quickly review, basically the Amud Beis. Rabbi had said in the name of Rav Huna that it says in the Torah lo yitame, and it says lo yavai, which tells you that you can get a prohibition for tumah, which is just to become tameh, as a nazir, as a kohen, they share halachas, and regarding lo yavai, of the tumah of coming into a place of tumah. But tumah v'tumah loy, if you're already tameh and then you become tameh again, then you're not going to have a liability. Rav Yosef says no. I'll tell you what Rav Huna said. Rav Huna said even tumah and tumah. He says, I'll bring you a raya, because Rav Huna said halacha. If there was a nazir standing in the cemetery, and he's tummy, he's in the cemetery, and they pass him, a relative of his, or some other mess, and he touches it, he's going to be chayiv. What do you mean? He's already tummy. Obviously, we can infer from that, Rav Huna said, even tumah v'tumah. So on that, Abaye had asked a brisa. Abaye had said, if there's a kohen that has a mess on his shoulder, obviously he's tummy, and they pass him another mess, and he touches it, you would think it'd be chayiv. The brisa says, lo yichal, or the girsa was lo yichal, either one. It's only if you're not mechul. This is excluded where he's mechul v'oimid. So you see, says Abaye from the brisa, that tumah v'tumah loy. If you're already tameh, you cannot become liable for a tumah again. So on that, Rabbi responded back, he says, what do you mean? What do you do with our Mishnah? Our Mishnah said, and this is why we brought in this discussion, if someone was mitameh l'meisim old day as a nazir, which one of the three prohibitions of a nazir to become tameh, old days only chayiv one. But if they tell him al tetameh, he's chayiv for every single one. Why? He's mitameh v'koyim, he's already tameh. So that was the response that Rabbi was giving back. So the Gemara says elakash hadadi. So you have this contradiction between the Mishnah and the Brisa. So it's not clear where the Gemara ends off, because the Rush brings two different interpretations. Is the Gemara trying to resolve for Rabbah or for Rav Yosef? But the Gemara does differentiate anyway between the Mishnah and the Brisa to show you it's not a contradiction, so each one should still hold their own regarding if it's yes tumah v'tumah or no tumah v'tumah. But the Gemara says, Abaye, the way Tais says, Abaye answers, he says, no, don't tell me the Mishnah is contradicting the Brisa. The Brisa talk about bichiburim, when he's connected. When you're connected, so then you can't become tummy again. You're already connected to the tumah. The Mishnah is shalai bichibur, when you're not connected. You're not connected, so even though you're already tameh, but you're not connected to the source of the tumah, so therefore that would be another liability. So the Gemara asked, what, tumah bichibur is der raisa? But Rabbi Yitzchak said that they only said this halacha of tumah bichiburin only for truma v'kachim. But for Nazir and Oisa Pesach, let's say a guy is going to be considered tameh for his bringing his come Pesach, we didn't say it. But if he says der raisa, what's the difference? So the last thing we said from the previous stuff was, kam b'chibur adam, kam b'chibur adam ba'adam, kam b'chibur adam b'mes. Which, that's also a discussion in Taisus, what exactly does that mean? One of the interpretations means that one is you're touching the person who's touching the mess. The other one is you're touching the person who's touching the person who's touching the mess. So there's another person there in the way. When did we say zayrai? So when you're touching the person who's touching the mess. That's chiburi, that's tumah b'chiburin. Yeah, that's a more severe thing, because it's metama the guy who's not even touching the mess. He's touching the guy who's touching the mess, but it's only when he's actually touching the mess. So therefore, even if you're tameh, but if you detach yourself, touching again is the severity factor, as we see for the guy who's touching. We said it's not right, so only place in truma kachim. That's when you're touching a person who's touching a person who's touching a mess. That's where the Gemara ended. That's how Gemara now is going back to the opinion of Rabbah, who said that you could have tumah for tumah and for bia, meaning for coming into oil, but you can't have tumah for tumah, and the Gemara is going to ask on that opinion. Shir is co-sponsored by Kazir and Cheskel. Turn to Daf Yomi, for today's Daf. So we're discussing today's Daf, are mechul ba'imid. This halacha, continuing this theme, if a guy's already desecrated, is there liability for making yourself a chilul again or not? Regarding the case of goisis and magud, if a kohen is allowed to go ahead and come in contact with someone in the throes of death, or he's been dismembered, but he's not yet dead. In Amud Beis, the Gemara discussed regarding the case of if Nikta Rosh Shalava, if his father was beheaded, is generally a kohen's allowed to be metamet to his 7 relatives. Could he be metamet to his father, who is not a full mess? And some of the terms that come up in today's daf are mes mitzvah. The halacha that even though a Nazir or kohen gadol, they're never allowed to be metamet, but for mes mitzvah, someone has no one to bury them, they're allowed to, and actually it's a mitzvah and the obligation for them to bury them. And Ivim and a Chai is a limb from a living person, which has halacha like an Ivim and a Mez, has that same tumah. So we begin on the bottom of Membeis Mabez, 3 lines up at the bottom of the Yamid. We had mentioned on the top of Membeis Mabez the opinion of Rabbah. Like we mentioned, that he says that lahazire ala tumah, lahazire ala biyah. You can have 2 liabilities for becoming tamei and for entering into oil mes. But tumah v'tumah loy. But if you're ready tamei, and then you touch tumah, so you're not going to be liable because you're ready tumah already before. So on that's where the Gemara says, "Abo tumah v'tumah loy." You're telling me, but tumah and tumah you cannot be liable for. Why? Very simply, because the metameh v'koim, because you're already tameh, which was how we explained the brisa that we had mentioned, which was that saying that, which was Abaye really responding to Rav Yosef and saying like Rabbah that, what do you mean? You're already mechul, and therefore there's no additions, as the Girsa of Rav Ranchberg, that you're already mechul v'oimid, and therefore there's not going to be anything more over here where you have the mess on the person's shoulder, and he goes and so you're ready, tell me ready. So says the Gemara, if that's the case, Tuma biyanami. So the question is, regarding if let's say someone has the mess on their shoulder and he goes into oila mess, and they warn him, wait a second, there's is of lo yavai. It says in the Torah lo yavai that he's not allowed to come into oila mess. And of lo yitma, says the Gemara, hametame v'kai. What do you mean? Here also, he's already tummy ready. So why is he getting lashes for coming into the oila mess? As Taisa explains, if you think it's talking about where he touched the mess and then he let go of the mess, and now he's going to oila mess, well, for that, we already established on this top of this amid that even tumah v'tumah you'd get lashes to tumah, because then he's not mechol v'amid, because he's not bechiburin anymore. He detached himself. So obviously, Rabbah agrees that tumah v'tumah you would get if you're still attached, but he's saying he's contrasting tumah and biyah and tumah. He's saying tumah biyah you could have, tumah not. Obviously, it means to say you're still holding on to the tumah, because or else tumah you would also have. So then, what's the case of tumah biyah? But you're already tumah. How are you going to be chayiv for coming into the oil hames? So on that, the Gemara answers, Amr Rabbi Yechanan. He says, you're right. They're talking about 2 different cases. Kan bebayis, meaning if you're entering into a house that inside there's a mess, and he wasn't tummy beforehand, that's what we're saying. They get lashes 2 times. One for lo yitma, not to become tummy. One for lo yov, not to come into oil hames. Because when you come into the house, both are happening at the same time. But kan bisadeh. But in other words, when we were saying tumah v'tumah, that's obviously without an oil, because it's not lo yav, it's tumah v'tumah. Now, you cannot have a liability of 2 at the same time. Why? If you touch 2 mason at the same time, you stick out your 2 hands and you touch it, that's all the same warning, because it's the same hasra of becoming tummy. And if he was carrying a mess on his shoulder and they warned him regarding tumah and he touches and they pass him another mess, he's mechol v'ayimid. There's no tosefet tumah from the second one. That's how Taisa explains. He brings from the Mefarish, from Rashi, that says what he finds very difficult. Rashi wants to say that when do we say that he's mechayiv on biyah and tumah? If, for example, he comes into a house that has a mess inside of it, where again, like Taisa said, tumah and biyah are happening at the same time. The other case he wants to say, which Taisa finds difficult, is when we're saying in the Brayso says mechul v'oimid that tumah v'tumah loy is, for example, if he touches a mess in the field and then he enters into oil that has a mess in it, doesn't be pater because they're mechul v'oimid, which is not like the way Taisa is explaining, and Taisa finds that difficult to understand what is that contrast of those 2 cases. But be that as it may, the Gemara is answering. You're right. It's talking about where you are not tummy beforehand, and you're doing both at the same time. So tumah v'tumah, of course you're not adding anything, and tumah and Tumah of Bia, it's happening at the same time. Therefore, you're going to be chayiv for both. Now, the problem is, as the Gemara continues to talk about with Aleph, is that Bebayis Nami. Now, the Gemara gets very technical now. Even by a house, Kivin the Ayil Yodei, once his hands enter into the house, is taiv. He becomes tamei. As Tais explains, there's halacha that oil mes is kamal yitam madamya. It's like it's filled with tumah, like it's like toxic air. The moment that you stick your hands inside, it's as if you touched the mess. And yet you don't have lo yava yet, because your body didn't go in yet. Didn't even have your majority. So ki ayil kuli hai, when your whole body comes in, tamehu, you're ready tamei, and you're mechul v'oimid. So you can't have lo yava with lo yatame. Only if is going to be mechul v'oimid. So therefore, we shouldn't have darshan lehechaloi to be memayit mechul v'oimid. It should have been learned from a different drasha. I mean, you should learn it for a different drasha. What is this that we're telling you that, it's only, it's lehechali is telling you that, that was referring to the Bryce on the previous daf, that to tell you that, yotzezeshu mechul v'oimid, as if it's sounding like that there is a case that you're not mechul v'oimid, because that's lo yavai, but there is no case of lo yavai. There's never a case that you could be chayiv 2 times. Because the moment you come into the house with your hands, you're ready tamei. And then we said, okay, now you can't have the Isser Lo Yavai now because you already are tamei already. So exactly, that's Elma Rav Laza. He says, Tzirif Yadai. If the guy goes ahead and he's mitzaref his hand to the bias, in other words, that he comes into the house before his body, Mishum Tuma Ika, he has Tama. No, in other words, he's saying like this. If the guy sticks his hand into the house before his body, then you're right. Mishum Tama Ika, you can have Tama. Mishum Bialeka, you're right. You're not going to have the Isra of Bia because it's Mechol V'oimid. But, V'tziriv Gufay. But if, let's say, his hands were bound, so to speak, were straight down on his body and they don't come in first, then Tuma Bia, B'hadi Adodikasi. So then the Tuma and the coming in are happening at the same time. Now, Tais brings from the Ram that even though a house that has a nega, the Gemara in Chulin Daf Gimel tells us that the hands are only tumah b'rabanan, even though mitzvah is metam ba'oil. So why here are we saying that? We're saying if your hands come in first, so your hands are going to become tamei, so then you're ready tamei. What do you mean? I thought the halacha of hands being tamei is only rabbinic, not deraisa. Says Taisus, no, it's not like the hasim halachas as tumah, because you're right. By a house that has a nega, if you come into your tamei, even if you don't touch anything, but even so, we see in the Mishnayos that if there's a mechitza, kosher, if there's a partition for the mitzayir, it doesn't contaminate him, but by tumas mes, even if there's a small little opening that brings a tumah, so basically Tais is answering and saying that they're not the same halachas. And by tumah, if there's a mess inside, yes, just putting in your hands, you would be tumah deraisa, even though by a house with a neg, you only be rabbinically tumah. But be that as it may, the Gemara says, I have a good answer. Here we're talking about where the guy doesn't come in with his hands first. So the Gemara says, yes, but you have to ask better. But it's not possible that his nose won't come in first, and therefore v'nachas lo tumah, and therefore he's going to have lo yitame before lo yavai. How you tell me having in case lo yavai when his hands are not sticking out, when he's keeping his hands by his side, so therefore his body is having lo yitma and lo yavai at the same time. What do you mean the nose sticks around, it sticks out from the person's face. So Elam rather says, Hichnis yadai, you're right. When the guy sticks in his hand, like we said, Mishum Tuma Ika, which Taisa really says, in other words, not really his hands, because it's his nose. His nose sticks in first, so it's going to be Tuma. Mishum Bialaka, but it's not going to be a problem about Lo Yavai, because you're already Tummy. But Hichnis Gufai, if let's say you stick in your body, Tuma bi bahade adodikasin. Then Tuma and coming in are happening at the same time. In other words, says Taisus, when the guy is bending his head out of the house. So he's bending out and he's walking with his body, but he's sticking his head backwards. So his nose is not coming in first. So he's playing limbo. He's sticking his head very far back and his body's coming in. So he's going to have lo yavai and lo yitam at the same time. He's not having anything else sticking first. But the Gemara says, what do you mean? It's not possible that his toes, right, when you look at a person, the bottom of his feet, his toes stick out more than the rest of his bodies. So it's not possible that some of his toes, the belly, but it's not possible that his toes are sticking out for his v'nachas l'tumah, and that it's going to rest tumah on him. Now, Taisa 1 that says, why do you have to say that the toes are sticking out and you'll have lo yitame before lo yavai? Says, why can't it be talking about the guy walked in backwards? In the back of a person, you don't have toes sticking out. Then that's equal, that's flush with the person's body. So that's Taisa no, because walking in backwards is not considered entry, as the Gemara says in Shvuas and the Chulin. But really, Taisa, we could have asked the question according to everyone, that whatever it is, it's not possible that there won't be a little bit of the person's body that will enter in first, and then you'll be tummy before the majority of your body comes in. And it's inevitable. A person is only considered having entered when the majority of his body's in. So however you're getting in, the moment the part of you is in, you already have lo yatame. So you're not going to be able to have lo yavai. There's a Taisa that says, really, this could have kept on going on. We'll find something that enters in before the majority of the body. So the Gemara really says two possible scenarios to answer this question. He says, you're right. He never enters in the regular way. He was brought in a closet, in the box, in a closet, some type of a closed a vehicle. Then his friend comes and takes off the covering of the box. The tumah biya b'hadei adodikasyan. Now the tumah and the entry are happening at the same time, which Taisa says you have to say that he assisted in removing the covering, because we're talking about where the guy's being warned that he's going to get malchus. If the friend did it, he was an oinus. But we're talking about where he helped with, so it's happening at the same time. That's how you have tumah and biya b'hadei adodi. Or another approach, Mabravashi says, could go into ayil kishu geisis. We're talking about we warned him about being metam b'lamest, but the guy wasn't dead yet. The guy was in the throes of death, and so there's no lo yitama lo yave when he comes in, but they're warning him because he's a geisis. And then v'nafik dishmas adi yasib. Then the guy's soul, when he's sitting over there, the tumah bi b'hadei adodikastin. So therefore, tumah and entry are happening at the same time. In other words, the Nazir was sitting there, and then at that time someone does. Which Taisa says, from here, it sounds like that a kohen is forbidden to enter into a cemetery, even for his relatives that are there, to make himself tameh, and even though he's mechul v'oimid, because even according to the words of Rabbah, that if you separate, you're also to be metame, because after you separate from your mess, he's going to go on other mesim, and he's going to mal on them. So that is prohibited for a kohen to make himself tameh, and that's what it says. Taisa seems like from our sugya that it'd be usher for a kohen to go and be metam himself in a cemetery, even for other people once he's tameh. Now the Gemara goes back and quotes something that we had quoted previously, a related discussion to what we had discussed in previously. We had mentioned on the previous Amid, depending on the Gisois, lehechaloi, but there's a Torah Banlun Braisa. Pasuk says in Vayikra, lehechaloi, which is a pasuk by the Kohen Hedjit. Pasuk there actually says, lo yitama bal ba'amov, the husband should not make himself tamei, lehechaloi, to make himself mechul, to desecrate himself, which is the prohibition of making himself tummy to not one of the primary 7 close relatives. Now, when they're telling you that you're not allowed to make yourself mechul, the word chol also means a dead person also, but it's ad shosha yamas. It's only until the moment that the person dies, meaning it's excluding if the guy is dismembered, because the word lehechale sounds like the person became a chalal. Lehechala, if the guy's a dead person, this man that's a kohen head does not make himself tamei because it's not one of the 7 close relatives. Rabbi Yomi, he says, there's another pasuk. The pasuk says by Nazir, and again, in our sugyas we keep on comparing the pasukim by Nazir and that of kohen head because they share some halachas, as we have Gezei Rishava elsewhere comparing them. By Nazir it says la'aval imalo yitama lahem b'maisam. His father and his mother, he's not making himself tamei when they're dead, which because the Nazir has halacha like kohen gadol is not even matama to his close relatives. So, b'maisam yitma achayamas, which means to say that he can make himself tummy to them until they die. When they die, then he cannot make himself tummy. So the Gemara says, "My benai." What's the difference between them? They're both saying that the prohibition is when the person dies. So this is mashmos dorshin the You're right. The only difference between them is the understanding of where we darshan this halacha from, where he's mamayit maguyid and geisis from lehechalei, and he's mamayit from b'maisa, meaning if the guy is dismembered or if the guy is a geisis in the throes of death, there's no problem about coming in contact with them. It's only when they're actually dead. But Rish Lakish, he gives another pshat. He says geisis ikbenai. Now the difference between them is a guy in the throes of death, as the Gemara explains. According to the one who learns it out from lehechaloi, that actually I feel a geisis, then even a geisis is going to be a problem. According to the one that learns out from b'maisim, when they're dead, is actually amasin only if they're actually dead. Geisis light, meaning lehechaloi is not the same word as misa. Why is not learning out from b'maisim? Oh, because maisim means literally death, and the guy's not dead, but it's still a chilul because the guy's in the throes of death. That's where Rish Lakish learns that's the differences regarding a geisis. Could a kohen come in contact with such a person or not? But then the Gemara wonders regarding each opinion, what does it do with the other one's sources? Says the Gemara, according to one that learns it out from lehechali the Tanakama, what does it mean? It says when they're dead. So how could you say that the Isra is even when they're geisis? Says the Gemara, no, look at Rabbi. He needs that pasuk of b'maisim to teach you the halacha of Rabbi. The Tanya we learn the Brayso Rabbi says that the Nazir, his halacha is b'maisim ein metame. When his relatives are dead, he cannot make himself tummy to them. Of metame b'negi asam u'b'zivasam. B'negi asam is actually the word, like a word of a nega. But he can make himself tummy to them in their nega tzaras, which is a tama, or their ziva, which is also a tama, which Tosfos finds is difficult because even by other things, the Nazir is not prohibited. It's only by tamas mes. Because the pasuk says, "Al kol nafshes meis lo yavi." Why do you need a special rebut to include that he's allowed to make himself tummy? But Tosfos brings from the Sifri that the drasha b'maisim lo yitma just tells us that you can't participate in the levaya, but you could sit by hesped and in the row when they console. And you're right, you don't really have to learn out anything from b'maisim lo yitma because you already know it was only al kol nafshes meis lo yavi. But be that as it may. That's what he says, b'maisim is coming to teach us. That it's only regarding the death, that type of tumah he cannot be mitamis up to his relatives. But the other tumas of his relatives, that you're allowed to. But again, we're not learning out from b'maisim, that's only when they're dead, because if it's even melei chalai, when they're even geisis, it's forbidden already for him to come in contact with them. Now the Gemara goes to the other mandama. The mandama and b'maisim, according to Rabbi, that learned out the halacha of from b'maisim when they're actually dead, but geisis is not a problem. When Rabbi himself, he's the one who said that we just quoted teaching from Rebbe. Rebbe says, "B'maisim teaches you it's only a problem for their death, not for some other tumah they have from nega or b'ziva." But how you learn the same word b'maisim to teach you that it's only when they're dead, but not when they're geisis. So the Gemara says, "I'll tell you why. Because in Cain, if that would be the case, lemukra b'mais, it should say when they die. My b'maisim, what's in their death? That's a plural that's unnecessary for the simple psuk. So shamit mina tarti. We learned both things. One is atshayamas. The other one is that it's only b'maisam, but not b'negasam or b'zivasam. So we learned two things. Now the Gemara says, okay, l'manda b'maisam, according to Rabbi, that learns b'maisam, except lechaloi. What does he do with lehechaloi? Lechaloi, that on the mandam and Tanakam is coming to tell you it's including geises. He's excluding geises from b'maisam. So the Gemara, lechaloi lahachri da'asa, he needs lechal to teach us something else. It's b'misha ina mechul, and this relates back to the teachings of the previous daf. Who is it forbidden to make mechal himself if he's not mechul already? It excludes that if, let's say, he already has a dead person on his shoulder, if it's already desecrated, then there's no problem about making himself a tummy. But then it says the Gemara, okay, according to the one that learned out from Lechaloi, to tell me that it's a problem of even for geises, which is a time when the person would die even if he's not dead. How could he learn from Lechaloi to include a geises? Doesn't he need it for this svara to tell you that it's only a problem when he's not mechul, but if he's mechul, it's not a problem? Says the Gemara, Hirosim Kain, if that's the case, if we only teach that halacha, limikra lahachal, it should say to desecrate. And they would know, but if he's already mechul, there's no problem. My lehechalai, what's the singular? To mechal him. Sham tarti, obviously we're learning a second thing, which is a miyut. To be a mayit, if it's mechul v'oimet, so it's teaching two things. One is teaching me that it's only it's going to be a problem of even if the guy's not dead, even if it's just the guy's a chalul, which he's calling a geis as a chalul, and lechalai is coming to tell you that, to desecrate him. But if it's already desecrated, then there's not going to be a problem. Okay, the Gemara says, Meisvei, the Gemara asks on the Tanakama from Mishnah Masechtas Always. The Mishnah says, Adam ein metame. A person cannot be metame, ela acha teitze nafshe. I mean, a person's not metame, does not contaminate, only when his soul leaves him. And, v'afilu maguyid, even if the guy is maguyid, which Rash says the word, Tais says the word is from like gudu lana, like to chop down the tree. Meaning you find him that he's dismembered, which Tais brings from the Gemara in Yevamis that actually is medayik from this Mishnah, that maguyid, a guy doesn't survive, but he's not metame yet, which actually machlekes tanoim if he's not going to live. But be it as it may, even if he's dismembered, even in the throes of death, he's still not metame. Says the Gemara, but according to the Rish Lakish explains that according to the one who learns from lechalei, that it's a problem even from when he's a geisis. What do you mean, hakatani? What do you mean? The Mishnah is teaching clearly, they ain't metame. There's not metame until he actually dies. So why are you saying it's a problem from when he's a geisis? Says the Gemara, no, there's two different contexts. Regarding bimetame, you're right. That we see in the Mishnah that no, your guy is not going to be a problem. Adinaf kenafshe until his soul leaves him. But le'ines chule regarding being mechal, the kohen or the nazir, ha'ischel, he is mechul. In other words, that we're going to darshan that the lava of la'yitma of the nazir of the kohen, it's as if it was near the word le'chale to warn them even regarding a geis because of chil. And Tais just points out we could have just easily explained that the Brisa is like the other Tana, like Rabbi. But definitely we could answer even according to the Tanakama and say that there's a difference between the halachas of Chil and the halachas of Tumah. Right? Tumah is only when the guy dies, but Chil is even when he's a geisis already. Which Shaisa says, from here we see that a kohen is not prohibited to come in contact with a geisis because Machlekes is Rabbi Yechanan and Rish Lakish, halachas like Rabbi Yechanan. And Rabbi Yechanan is the one who said that it's mashmos doshnik benayu, which means to say that everyone agreed is only when he dies, not when he's a geisis. But the Bahag's Girsa, which actually Mefarshim say it's not the Girsa, but Bahag's Girsa is that Abaya is instead of Rabbi Yechanan and Rav is instead of Rish Lakish. Now we know halach is like Rav instead of Abaya, except for 6 places. Now, according to Rav, that means to say it's Machlik is Rebbe and Rabbanan. Now we hold like Rebbe Mechaveir, but not Rebbe Mechaveir Rav. When Rebbe disagrees with Rabbanan, halach is like Rabbanan. Comes out that the kohen would be prohibited to come in contact with a geisis. So differences of how the girsa is about what the halach is going to be according to what Taisa explained. We continue Talmud Beis, where the Gemara continues with a related discussion regarding this halacha of the kohen, of the nazir being metame likraivav. So Amar Rav Chizda Maravi says, Niktar Roisha Shel Aviv. If the father's head got dismembered, if he got beheaded, the halacha is ein metamalai, which Taisa says we're talking about a kohen hedjit, who's allowed to be metamet to his father, not by kohen gadol and the nazir who are not metamet to the relative. Talking about a kohen hedjit, it's allowed to be metamet to his relative, but if his father's beheaded, then he cannot be metamet him. So my time, what's the reason? Because Amakra says Rav Chizda pasuk says, and there's a pasuk in Vayikra that says only to his close relatives, to his mother, and it says la'aviv, to his father, to his son, to his daughter. It goes to all the now. So when it says to his father, it means bizman shul when the father's intact, it's his father. But now when the father is missing, when the father's head is off, then you cannot metame to the father. So Amalei Rav Nuna says to him, wait a second, if that's the case, if someone's going in this valley, which was it's in the hood, there was hoodlums, and there was thieves, and then these thieves beheaded his father. Are you going to tell me that there also he cannot go ahead and be metame to his father? In other words, what the Gemara's question is that what does it want to say? Well, what case would he be talking about? As Mefarshim explained, it seemed to be self-understood that we're talking about a mes mitzvah. He's asking, what does that mean that if his father's bad, he cannot be involved with him? Somebody says to him, "Oh no! When these guys walking in the valley with these thieves, meis mitzvah ka'amrid? Are you talking about a dead person that is a mitzvah to bury him?
The head is missing, or the head is there, it's just not intact?
Not intact.
That's already not...
Yeah, he's not Aviv, he's not his whole father.
So if we're talking about
Right. The question is, what's considered missing? Would it be a whole aver or something? La'aviv. Yeah, has to be his whole father. It's a machlokes. We'll see. It's a machlokes, but yeah, that's if it's missing, then he's not complete. He's not intact. So he says, no. You're talking about the guys in the dangerous place. Hashta yishlam b'achrin. If you're going to say even other people that are not relatives, mechayiv, the kohen is obligated to bury that person, even if he's whatever the situation is. Bavla koshkin by his father, isn't it all the more so? So I wasn't talking about when he's bepaksa the arvis. That's a mes mitzvah. So the Gemara says, really? V'hai mes mitzvahu? Would that really be a situation of a mes mitzvah? For time, in the Bryce says, mes mitzvah. What's considered mes mitzvah? Is kol she'en le'koivin. If he doesn't have anyone that could bury him, meaning, as Teisagir says, kol she'koiri be'en acherim oinoisai. If the dead person would call out and no one would answer him, that's considered a mes mitzvah. But if someone calls out and there's others who could respond to him, in other words, if the mes could call out and others would respond to him that are his relatives, it's a mes mitzvah. No, it's not a mes mitzvah. So but over here, so here he has a son who could go ahead and hire others to be busy with him. So what would make him a mes mitzvah? That you're saying that, I never said such a case, and that of course the father he would be able to bury his father. So it says the Gemara, no, kivin the ka'azal ba'orcham. Since they're traveling on the road, it's like as if they don't have anyone to bury him, because it's not frequent that people pass by over there. So therefore the son would be able to bury the father in that type of situation. I wasn't talking about that type of situation. Now the Re says, if someone's coming to engage with a mes mitzvah, meaning there's no one to bury him, so if there's a Yisrael that could be busy with him, even if he's not, that Yisrael is not relatives, then the kohen, who even if he's a relative, should not go ahead, meaning he's not one of the 7 close relatives, according to many who explain this in Taisus, he should not go ahead, the kohen should not bury that mes mitzvah even though it's a mes mitzvah, which a kohen's allowed to. But if the Yisrael could do it, even if it's his relative and the Yisrael is non-relative, he shouldn't do it. And the proof is from the Gemara later on of Mem Zayin. Regarding mes mitzvah, we talk about if there's a kohen gadol and Nazir walking on the road. The Gemara says, okay, who should be metamed? Let the Nazir do it and not the kohen. For sure, if you have a kohen Yisrael, let the Yisrael do it and not the kohen. But Taisus wonders, he says, but how do we understand the Gemara in Yavamas that Peites? We said if someone's married to a minor wife, a little girl, halacha is when she dies, he yarshins her, he's metamed to her. The Gemara says, wait a second, if the Chacham don't have the kohen to be ikir biblical halacha, so the father should be able to metamed to her, not the husband. So the Gemara answers, no, that since the relatives are not going to inherit her, she could call out all day and they're not going to respond to her because the husband inherits her. So says Taisa, wait a second. If there's no one else to be busy, so what do you have to say? It's because his wife. Even another person, the kohen would be able to metamed to because of mes mitzvah. So you can tell me there's others that could be engaged in burying his minor wife? And even so we're saying that we're not concerned that it's considered like a mes mitzvah? So obviously you see that if you have a kohen and there's a mes lafanav and there's Yisrael, we're not concerned, and it is considered like a mes mitzvah, not like we just said. So the Rebbe says no, most definitely, it's in that case really it's not a mes mitzvah. It's only because her relatives would be negligent. The rabbis considered this minor wife like a mes mitzvah. And even though the Chacham don't have the ability to ikar biblical law, b'kum v'aseh, and here actively he's going to be metamed to this girl, that there's some other people in town that could bury her. Yeah, when there's reasons, the Chacham have the ability to do that. And he says, because he's seen that whole sugya over there, the Gemara doesn't bring from the case of a woman that she's believed to say my husband died, without being oike dvar Torah, she's a esha sesh, b'kum b'aseh. Obviously, when there's a reason for us to believe her, we have a koyach to be oike the biblical halacha. And by a woman, there's a reason, because she checks out because of the severity that would be, and if we believe her to be remarried, same thing is over here in the case of the mes mitzvah, regarding his minor wife. But you're right, in general, when a regular mes mitzvah, it says Taisus, most definitely the kohen shouldn't do it. He should let the Yisrael do it. But Al Kapon, in our case, we said that since there's no one on the road, it's like there's no kavrim, and therefore he's allowed to do it. But again, in general, the son cannot do it for the father if the father is beheaded. The Gemara says, the Gemara asks on Rav Chizda's halacha from the following brisa. The brisa quotes a pasuk by the kohen hedyot, by the regular kohen. It says there in the pasuk that to his sister, that's a virgin, that's close to him, that was never married to a husband, lo yitama tahar, he can make himself tameh, or he should make himself tameh. But the drasha tells us, lahu matame. Oh, tahar he makes himself tameh. But it does not make himself tummy to her limbs. Meaning, it's excluding if you have an aver that's from the living sister or aver from the dead sister, be that as it may, that is not allowed to be mitam himself to. And continues the brisa, because he cannot make himself tummy to a limb from his father that's living. In other words, even the father that's closer to him, he's not allowed to be mitam to aver of his father, which Tay says really learned this out from La'aviv. But be that as it may, the brisa is saying he could be mitam himself. He cannot be mitam himself to the aver for the father. But what he could do is he could come back for a bone the size of a barley corn, meaning to bury it. Meaning if he really was matam himself to the father's whole body, and then there's a bone that was left over, he can go back and get that bone. Says the Gemara, wait a second. What does it mean that he goes back to the bone the size of a barley corn? Lav lememra, isn't that to say the imichse puta, that if it's missing a little bit, and even so, even though the father's missing, but you see the son can be matam himself to the father. So you see that the father doesn't have to be intact. How can you see the father has to be intact from your drush of La'aviv? Says the Gemara, that's not difficult. I hear Rabbi Yehuda. That brisa you're asking from is Rabbi Yehuda. They sound like in the brisa. It's a machlekes. It's a machlekes tanoim regarding this halacha. Rabbi Yehuda, he says lo matame. It says in the pasuk that to his sister he could be matame, which is tahar, the whole sister. Vein matame levarem, but he cannot matame to her limbs. Shein matame leivim nachay shalav, that he cannot matame himself to the limb from his father. A matame leivim min ameis shalav, but he could be matame to the limb of for his father that is dead, meaning by going back. If he was ready matame to the rest of the body, as Tais explains, initially, meaning Rabbi Yehuda definitely agrees that you're not allowed to matame to a limb of the father, like in the brisa we brought before. The whole question was regarding if he was matame already, to matame himself to the rest. And that was saying that we see that Rabbi Yehuda, which Tais says is difficult because in that same brisa we have Rabbi Yehuda saying he could not matame himself to a bone the size of a barley corn of his father, but he could go back for etzem kesar. So he already says like Rabbi Yehuda. So he says maybe the whole thing is Rabbi Yehuda. But be that as it may, this if you could go back for the size of a barley corn, which obviously means the father's not intact, could you matame yourself to that or not? That is a machlekes tanoim, which, like we're saying, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi was we see at the end. That's only for when he's shalom. That's the last thing we're going to mention. But Rabbi Yehuda says, as we're going to quote right now, but Tanya, the Gemara says we learned in the brisa, Rav Kahana Reb Elazar ben Yaakov, he says that lo metame. It says in the pasuk tahari can be metame, but ve'in metame le'evarim, you cannot be metame to the limbs. Additionally, so in other words, Rabbi Yehuda agrees, and this is this brisa also. He agrees that you cannot metame. Everyone agrees you cannot metame to limbs. The question is, as we're going to see in this brisa, but if you have the majority of the father, that's the shaila. If you'd be able to metame to. So therefore, if his head's missing, he still have the majority of the person. Like it says, additionally, prat the kazayis from the mess. It's excluding if you have an olive size of the dead person, kazayis netzel, which netzel is this liquid that oozes out of the dead person. If you have olive size of that, or umoli tarvid rakiv, if you have a spoonful of the dust of the decomposition of the dead mess, all these things you're not allowed to be metame to. But says the brisa, you would think that you cannot metame to this spinal column, or to the skull, or to the majority of the structure, which the Gemara later on is going to explain is the two thighs and the two hips and the one thigh or two thighs and one hip. Either way, or the majority of the structure of the person, or the majority of the number of limbs. Gemara later on is going to explicitly mention these two, but Reb Minyan is 125 Evarim because the person is 248, so 125 would be majority ready. You would think that also he cannot be metame to his father's majority. Siv, that's what it says in the pasuk, Emor, and it says V'amarta Alehem. So it says Emor lekahanim V'amarta. Say to the Kamet, say to them. What's this double say to them? The pasuk is adding on to you another tumah that you could be metame to, which Tay says the svara is that really you would say that Emma Vamarta would be going on the sister, which that's where we were learning out to exclude the limbs, because it said lo yatama, but not to her limbs. And then we're coming to add on, but you could be metama to Reb Binyana. That's why the Gemara continues to talk about Memdalim and Alf, and the Brisa continues and says, okay, but yachal lo yatama l'chadil goods, but you would think that however you cannot be metama to the spinal column, to the skull, Reb Binyana, the majority of the structure, Reb Binyana, the majority of the number of limbs, shelacherim, of other relatives that I mentioned in the Torah, because it only says lo yatama, which says the whole har, but not parts of har. But we're including, when we're saying Ema V'amarta, like another saying, but what we're saying you're allowed to be Mitami, we'll add on a little bit more, which is also the majority. So I would think maybe it's only by the sister and not by the other relatives. Amrit, so you're going to say no. What do you mean? Compare them. Ma'achai, just like the system Yuchad is designated Shaguva Tali Boy, that her body is dependent on him. In other words, his relative, he has obligation to bury her. And the truth is, the Gemara could have said, that you could think that he would be able to be metamed to other mason, even to their limbs, if you don't learn that from Achaisa, because it's only about her that says law. But be that as it may, the Gemara said we compare it for both. And the halacha is, to all these different elements that we said. Of course, so to anyone that the body is dependent on him, his father, or whatever, all those 7 relatives, he can be to all these different things of his other relatives. So, who is this Brisa? Says the Gemara, hahinam Rabbi Yehuda. That's also Rabbi Yehuda, who he says that the majority of the person you could be metame to. But for Rav, meaning Rav Chizis halacha is damika haytana. He's going like the following Tana. So again, like we're showing that it's a machlekes tanoim. To sound like learn the Brisa. Ma'aseh shemeis Rabbi Yitzchak beginzig. There's a story that the father of Yitzchak passed away in Ginzig. Only 3 years later did he find out his father passed away. So he came to ask Rabbi Shub ben Elisha, and the 4 elders that were with him. In other words, he wanted to bury his father where his, the ancestral plots are. So he wanted to move his father. When they said, no, la'aviv, this that you're kain and you're allowed to be metamed to your father is bizman shur shalom. It's only when it's intact. Bizman shur chaser, not when he's missing. And as some Girsayis add on the words, after 3 years, most definitely he's not going to be intact anymore, and therefore you don't have the heter anymore of being metame yourself to your father of la'aviv. So you see that this is a machlekes tanoim. On Amid Beis, our halacha of Chizim Rav start off in Niktar Roishoi, that if the father is beheaded, you cannot be metamed him. And we say, why? You learn from la'aviv. We see a brisa clearly that says that you see etzem kisa'ira, you could go back for. And that means to say you're metama for the majority of the person, even though it was missing that etzem kisa'ira. And we have another brayse that says that even for just the spine or the skull or Reb Binyana, you could be metama to. That's not the whole person. Shub ben Elisha is who Rav Chiz was going like, that after 3 years he was not going to be intact, and therefore he cannot be metama to him. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda, with those 2 other brayses that says yes, you can metama l'shel, each one is considered a major part of the body, and then you can metama to him. Thank you to any time for hosting us.